Well, I don't think the test of a law's constitutionality is whether it more adheres to the libertarian principles of the Cato Institute or the statist principles of someone else. I think the test of a law's constitutionality is not those policy questions. It's whether or not the law is regulating things that negatively affect commerce or don't. And since obviously the failure to purchase an item doesn't create the kind of effects on supply and demand that the market participants in Wickard and Raich did, and doesn't in any way interfere with regulation of the insurance companies, I don't think it can pass the basic...
I thought that Wickard was, you must buy. We're not going to let you use the homegrown wheat. You have to go out in the market and buy that wheat that you don't want.
Oh, but let's be careful about what they were regulating in Wickard, Justice Ginsburg. What they were regulating was the supply of wheat. It didn't in any way imply that they could require every American to go out and buy wheat. And yes, one of the consequences of regulating local market participants is it'll affect the supply and the demand for the product. That's why you can regulate them, because those local market participants have the same effect on the interstate market that a black market has on a legal market. But none of that is true. In other words, you can regulate local bootleggers, but that doesn't suggest you can regulate teetotalers, people who stay out of the liquor market, because they don't have any negative effect on the existing market participants or on regulation.
Well, that's why I suggested, Mr. Carvin, that it might be different if you were raising an as-applied challenge and presenting a class of people whom you could say clearly would not be in the health care market. But you're raising a facial challenge. And we can't really know which of the many, many people that this law addresses in fact will not participate in the health care market and in fact will not impose costs on all the rest of us. So the question is, can Congress respond to those facts that we have no crystal ball, that we can't tell who is and isn't going to be in the health insurance market, and say most of these people will be? And most of these people will thereby impose costs on the rest of us, and that's a problem that we can deal with on a class-wide basis.
No, again, the people who impose the cost on the rest of us are people who engage in a different activity at a different time, which is defaulting on their health care payments. It's not the uninsured. Under your theory, you could regulate anybody if they've got a statistical connection to a problem. You could say, since we could regulate people who enter into the mortgage market and impose mortgage insurance on them, we can simply impose the requirement to buy private mortgage insurance on everybody before they've entered the market, because we're doing it in this prophylactic way before it develops. And
no, that's not. I don't think that's fair, because not everybody is going to enter the mortgage market. Well, the government's position is that almost everybody is going to enter the health care market. 2
points, one of which Mr. Clements already made, which is the health insurance market is different than the health care market. But let me take it on full stride. I think everybody's in the milk market. I think everybody's in the wheat product market. But that doesn't suggest that the government compel you to buy 5 gallons of meat or 5 bushels of wheat, because they are not regulating commerce. Whether you're a market participant or not, they are still requiring you to make a purchase that you don't want to do. And to get back to your facial example...
That's true of almost every product.
I'm sorry?
It's true of almost every product, as directly or indirectly by government regulation. The government says, borrowing my colleague's example, you can't buy a car without emission control. I don't want a car with emission control. It's less efficient in terms of the horsepower. But I'm forced to do something I don't want to do by government regulation.
You are not forced to buy a product you don't want. And I agree with you that since the government regulates all markets, there is no limiting principle on their compelled purchase. When they put these environmental controls on the car...
They force me to buy, if I need,
no.
Unpasteurized goods, goods that don't have certain pesticides but have others. There is government compulsion in almost every economic decision because the government regulates so much. It's a condition of life that some may rail against, but...
Let's think about it this way. Yes, when you've entered the marketplace, they can impose all sorts of restrictions on you. And they can impose, for example, all kinds of restrictions on states after they've enacted laws. They can wipe out the laws. They can condition them. But what can't they do? They can't compel states to enact laws. They can't compel states to carry out federal law. And I am arguing for precisely the same distinction, because everyone intuitively understands that regulating participants after A and B have entered into a contract is fundamentally less intrusive than requiring A to contract.
We let the government regulate the manufacturing process, whether or not the goods will enter into interstate commerce, merely because they might statistically. There's all sorts of government regulation of manufacturing plants, of agricultural farms, of all sorts of activity that will be purely intrastate because it might affect interstate activity.
I fully agree with you, Justice Sotomayor.
So how is that different from saying you are self-insuring today, you're foregoing insurance? Why isn't that a predecessor to the need that you're eventually going to have?
The cases you referred to, I think, effectively eliminated the distinction between participants in the intrastate market vis-a-vis participants in the interstate market. None of those cases suggest that you can regulate people who are outside of the market on both an intrastate and interstate level by compelling them to enter into the market.
What about, the simplest counterexample for me to suggest is you've undoubtedly read Judge Sutton's concurring opinion. All right, he has about 2 pages, it seemed to me, of examples where everyone accepts the fact that under these kinds of regulations, the government can compel people to buy things they don't otherwise want to buy. For example, he gives, even in that farm case, the farmer was being forced to go out and buy grain to feed to his animals because he couldn't raise it at home. And he goes through one example after another. So what is your response to that, which you've read?
Judge Sutton is wrong in each and every example. There was no compulsion in Rage for him to buy wheat. He could have gotten wheat substitutes, or he could have not sold wheat, which is actually what he was doing. There is a huge difference between conditioning regulation, i.e. conditioning access to the healthcare market and saying you must buy a product, and forcing you to buy a product.
It was common ground that the requirement that in the insurers, the community-based one, and they have to insure you despite your health status. They can't refuse because of pre-existing conditions. The government tells us, and Congress determined, that those two won't work unless you have a pool that will include the people who are now healthy. First, do you agree with your colleague that the community-based, and what's the name that they give to the other?
The guaranteed issue.
Yeah, that is legitimate Commerce Clause legislation?
Oh, sure, and that's why. But we don't in any way impede that sort of regulation. These non-discrimination regulations will apply to every insurance company, just as Congress intended, whether or not we buy insurance.
Well, then what about the determination that they can't possibly work if people don't have to buy insurance until their health status is such that the insurance company just dealt with them on as it will. It said, I won't insure you because you're already sick.
It depends what you mean by work. It'll work just fine in ensuring that no sick people are discriminated against. But when you do that,
but the sick people, why would they insure early if they're going to be protected if they get insurance late?
This is the government's very illogical argument. They seem to be saying, look, we couldn't just force people to buy insurance to lower health insurance premiums. That would be no good. But we can do it because we've created the problem. We, Congress, have driven up the health insurance premiums, and since we've created that problem, this somehow gives us authority that we wouldn't otherwise have. That can't possibly be right.
Do you think that there's what percentage of the American people who took their son or daughter to an emergency room and that child was turned away because the parent didn't have insurance, do you think there's a large percentage of the American population who would stand for the death of that child?
One of the most
They had an allergic reaction and a simple shot would have saved the child?
One of the more pernicious, misleading impressions that the government has made is that we are somehow advocating that people get thrown out of emergency rooms, or that this alternative that they've hypothesized is going to be enforced by throwing people out of emergency rooms. This alternative, i.e. you condition access to health care on buying health insurance, is enforced in precisely the same way that the Act does. You either buy health insurance or you pay a penalty of $695. You don't have doctors throwing people out on the street, so the only difference...
Did you say the penalty's okay, but not the mandate? I'm sorry, maybe I misheard you.
No. They create this straw man that says, look, the only alternative to doing the way we've done it, if we condition access to health care on buying health insurance, the only way you can enforce that is making sick people not get care. I'm saying, no. There's a perfectly legitimate way they could enforce their alternative, i.e. requiring you to buy health insurance when you access health care, which is the same penalty structure that's in the Act. There is no moral dilemma between having people have insurance and denying them emergency service. Congress has made a perfectly legitimate value judgment that they want to make sure that people get emergency care. Since the founding, whenever Congress has imposed that public responsibility on private actors, it has subsidized it from the federal treasury. It has not conscripted a subset of the citizenry and made them subsidize the actors who are being hurt, which is what they're doing here. They're making young, healthy people subsidize insurance premiums for the cost that the non-discrimination provisions have put on insurance and insurance companies. And that is the fundamental problem.
So I want to understand the choices you're saying Congress has. Congress can tax everybody and set up a public health care system.
Yeah.
That would be okay.
Yeah. Tax power is unlimited.
Okay. Congress can, or are you taking the same position as your colleague? Congress can't say, we're going to set up a public health system, but you can get a tax credit if you have private health insurance because you won't access the public system. Are you taking the same position?
There may have been some confusion in your prior colloquy. I fully agree with my brother Clement that a direct tax would be unconstitutional. I don't think he means to suggest, nor do I, that a tax credit that incentivizes you to buy insurance creates problem. Congress incentivizes all kinds of activities. If they gave us a tax credit for buying insurance, then it would be our choice whether or not that makes economic sense.
So how's that different than this Act, which says if a taxpayer fails to meet the requirement of having minimum coverage, then they are responsible for paying the shared responsibility payment?
The difference is that the taxpayer is not given a choice. It's the difference between banning cigarettes and saying I'm going to enforce that legal ban through a $5 a pack penalty and saying, look, if you want to sell cigarettes, fine, I'm going to charge you a tax of $5 a pack. And
I think that's what's happening, isn't it?
No,
I thought that everybody was paying, what is it, $10 a pack now? I don't even know the price. It's pretty high.
Right.
I think everybody recognizes that it's all taxation for the purposes of dissuading you to buy it.
That's precisely my point. And everyone intuitively understands that that system is dramatically different than saying cigarettes tomorrow are illegal.
It is different. It is different. Okay. I agree with that. But you pointed out, and I agree with you on this, that the government set up these emergency room laws. The government set up Medicaid. The government set up Medicare. The government set up CHIP. And there are 40 million people who don't have the private insurance.